The Willamette River didn't care that October had come early to Portland. It didn't care about the tourists who jogged the scenic trail above its banks, their breath misting in the cold morning air, earbuds blocking out the world. It didn't care about the commuters who crossed the overpass every morning without a second glance at the muddy shoreline below, their minds already at work, ready stressed, ready planning their escape from the city on Friday afternoon. And it certainly didn't care about the 17-year-old ghost who had made his home in the icy shadows beneath that bridge for the last 19 months. Declan Thorne had learned the brutal mathematics of survival: calories burned versus calories scavenged, hours of sleep versus hours awake enough to hear footsteps approaching, visibility versus safety, distance from the warming shelter versus distance from the police sweeps that happened every third Thursday. He had calculated every variable down to the last shivering degree, mapping the city like a general mapping enemy territory, and the answer was always the same: stay invisible, stay alive, repeat. The concrete underside of the Interstate 205 overpass was his ceiling. Graffiti tagged the pillars, layers upon layers of spray paint, forming a strange archaeological record of the neighborhood's evolution. Someone had written "Hope dies here" in dripping red letters. Someone else had crossed it out and written "Hope starts here" in fading blue. Both were wrong. Hope didn't exist here at all. The thick, frozen Oregon mud was his floor, a combination of silt from the river runoff from the highway above and the accumulated refuse of a city that had forgotten this corner existed. 3 layers of salvaged clothing were his walls against a world that had stopped seeing him the moment he slipped out of a second-story window in Seattle and disappeared into the rain. That was March of last year. He was 15, then almost 16, old enough to know that running would be hard, young enough to believe it couldn't be worse than staying. He had been wrong about that second part. Running was harder. The cold in late October wasn't the kind that made you shiver. It was the kind that hollowed you out from the inside, excavating your core until you felt like a shell, a husk, something that used to be human but wasn't anymore. It crept into your marrow and made a home there, whispering that sleep wasn't rest anymore. Sleep was just rehearsal for the final performance, the one where you didn't wake up, where the cold finally won and your heart just quietly gave up in the pre-dawn hours. Declan had spent enough bitter nights under this bridge to know the difference. He wasn't sleeping when his eyes closed. He was just waiting to see if he'd wake up. Some mornings he was surprised when he did. Other mornings he was disappointed. It was a Tuesday. The sky was the color of old bruises, iron gray and swollen with the kind of rain that felt personal, like the universe had specifically chosen him to punish. The river had been rising for 3 days straight. Logs and uprooted brush churned past in the dark current, twisting and slamming into the rocks, with sounds like bones breaking. Like the river was consuming something alive and making sure everyone could hear it. Declan sat with his back against the cold concrete pillar, knees pulled to his chest, trying to coax a flame out of a disposable lighter he'd fished from a gas station trash can the night before. His fingers were numb, the skin cracked and bleeding around the knuckles. The lighter sparked twice, died sparked again. The mechanism was wearing out. He'd need to find another one soon. He held the tiny flame close to his hands and closed his eyes. For 3 seconds, he let himself imagine it was a fireplace. A real one, that came with a mantle decorated with family photos, stockings hung with care, even though nobody believed in Santa anymore. A dog sleeping on a rug, and a family that gave a damn whether he made it through the winter. He could almost smell the pine from a Christmas tree, almost hear laughter from a kitchen where someone was making hot chocolate. Then the flame burned his thumb, and he dropped the lighter with a hiss. The illusion shattered like glass. He was still here, still cold, still alone, still invisible. His stomach gnawed at his ribs with a ferocity that was becoming harder to ignore. 48 hours since he'd eaten anything but half a bag of stale pretzels someone had tossed near a park bench, probably for the pigeons. He'd waited until dark to grab them, making sure no one was watching, because even scavenging had its hierarchy and rules. His body had stopped asking politely for food weeks ago. Now it just hurt. A deep, persistent ache that made it hard to think about anything except the next meal that probably wasn't coming. He'd learned to drink as much water as possible from the public restroom at the trailhead, filling his stomach to trick it into thinking he'd eaten. It worked for an hour or two. Then the gnawing came back angrier. Declan leaned his head back against the pillar and stared up at the underside of the bridge. Water stains spread across the concrete like dark continents on a map of nowhere. He spent hours looking at them, seeing shapes. That one looked like a dragon. That one looked like Tommy's face. He squeezed his eyes shut. Don't think about Tommy. Thinking about Tommy meant thinking about the blood on the stairs, the way the younger boy's eyes had rolled back, the way Harlan had looked at Declan afterward with that calm, dead expression and said, "You tell anyone and you're next." Thinking about Tommy meant remembering that Declan had been too scared to do anything, too weak, too worthless. He thought about giving up. It was a thought that visited more often lately, usually when the cold sank so deep he couldn't stop shaking, when his teeth chattered so hard he thought they might crack. What was the point of this? There was no finish line, no diploma waiting at the end, no family wondering where he'd gone. His caseworker had probably checked a box that said, "Ran away, case closed," and moved on to the next kid in the system. If the river rose another few feet tonight and swept him away in his sleep, who would file a report? Who would notice one less ghost haunting the shadows of Portland? He exhaled slowly, watching the mist of his breath vanish into the damp air, like his life vanishing into the city. He finally got the lighter to catch again, cupping the flame against the wind that funneled through the overpass like a glacial breath straight from the Arctic. That was when he heard it, a sound cut through the monotonous roar of the swollen river. Sharp, high-pitched, human. A scream. Declan's eyes snapped open. The lighter slipped from his fingers and died in the mud with a soft hiss. He crawled out from beneath the overhang, his boots sinking into the thick icy sludge that lined the riverbank. Rain hammered his face, immediately fat drops that felt like tiny fists, soaking through the torn beanie that barely kept water out of his eyes. He squinted through the downpour, scanning the opposite bank first, then the trail above, then the river itself, searching for the source of the sound. A flash of unnatural color caught his eye. Neon pink, impossibly bright against the gray-black world of rain and mud and river. About 60 yards upriver, where the walking trail edged dangerously close to a steep, muddy embankment that had been eroding for years, where the Park Service had put up warning signs that nobody read. A dog was pacing frantically along the shoreline. A golden retriever, its fur plastered to its body by the rain, barking its head off at the violent water. The kind of desperate, panicked barking that meant something was very wrong. And there, bobbing in the churning, gray-black current, moving terrifyingly fast toward the jagged cluster of rocks the locals called Devil's Tooth, was the neon pink raincoat. It stood out like a beacon, like a scream, like a prayer nobody was answering. Inside that raincoat was a child. Declan's heart stopped for a full second, then slammed back to life with a violence that hurt. She was tiny, maybe 7 years old, hard to tell from this distance. Her small arms flailed uselessly against the overwhelming power of the river, like a moth caught in a hurricane. The current dragged her like a rag doll, tossing her toward the submerged boulders that created a brutal churning whirlpool. The water there was deep and fast and deadly. Local kids knew to stay away from Devil's Tooth. Adults knew. Everyone knew. If she hit those rocks, if the current pulled her under them into the cave-like spaces beneath, she was gone. Her body wouldn't surface for days, maybe weeks, maybe never. Declan looked around wildly, his head whipping back and forth. Where were her parents? Where was anyone? The trail was completely empty. The rain had driven everyone indoors. No joggers with their expensive running shoes and wireless headphones. No tourists taking photos of the scenic Pacific Northwest. Just a desperate dog, a drowning child, and a homeless teenager who couldn't even feel his own toes, whose body was already shutting down from malnutrition and cold. The girl breached the surface, gasping. Her mouth opened in a scream that the river swallowed whole. A wave of icy water crashed over her head like a fist and dragged her under again. She disappeared completely for 3 seconds, 4 or 5. Declan's heart slammed against his ribs so hard he thought it might break through. He should run for help, sprint up to the trail, find someone with a phone, call 911. That was the smart thing, the logical thing, the thing any sane person would do. He should scream, wave his arms, try to get attention. He should do anything except what every survival instinct in his malnourished body was screaming at him not to do. But then he saw it. The way the pink raincoat twisted in the current, the fabric billowing like a shroud. The way her small hand reached up out of the black water fingers, splayed, grasping at nothing, at air, at hope that wasn't there. And suddenly, he wasn't looking at a stranger anymore. He was looking at Tommy. Tommy, the younger foster kid in Victor Harlan's house in Seattle. Tommy, who was 9 years old with a gap-toothed smile and a red dinosaur backpack. Tommy, who loved Jurassic Park and couldn't pronounce the letter R, who called Declan Dequin and followed him around like a puppy. Tommy, who had ended up in the ICU 2 years ago with a fractured skull and 3 broken ribs after Harlan shoved him down the basement stairs for spilling juice on the carpet. The one Declan couldn't save because he was 15 and terrified and didn't know how, because when he'd threatened to go to the police, Harlan had locked him in that same basement for 5 days with no food and told him exactly what would happen if he ever opened his mouth. The one whose blood was still on Declan's hands, even though he hadn't been the one to spill it. The one he saw every time he closed his eyes. The girl screamed again, a thin, desperate sound that cut through the rain and the river and went straight into Declan's chest like a blade. Not again, not again, not this time. Declan didn't think. The survival instincts that had kept him alive on the streets for 19 months, the instincts that told him to stay hidden, stay safe, stay alive, vanished in an instant. They were replaced by a violent surge of something he'd thought died the night he crawled out of Harlan's window with 2 broken fingers, and a promise to himself that he'd never care about anyone ever again, that caring only got you hurt. He was wrong. He still cared. He cared so much it was killing him. He stripped off his denim jacket, the one he'd pulled from a donation bin 3 months ago, the one with someone else's name stitched inside. He kicked away the duct tape boots that were the only things between his feet, and frostbite the boots he'd found behind a Goodwill and repaired with tape scavenged from construction sites. The rain soaked through his thin hoodie, instantly plastering it to his skeletal frame, but he didn't feel the cold anymore. He only saw the pink raincoat. He only saw Tommy's face. He only heard that scream. Declan bolted down the rocky shoreline, sprinting parallel to the river, trying to get ahead of her. The mud slicked beneath his socks, offering no grip. Sharp stones sliced into his heels, leaving bloody footprints that the rain immediately washed away. His lungs burned with every breath, the cold air like knives in his chest. His legs screamed at him to stop, his muscles burning from malnutrition, from exhaustion, from 19 months of barely surviving. He pushed his malnourished body past every limit it had, past every warning his brain was throwing at him, past every rational thought that said this was suicide, that he was too weak, too small, too broken to save anyone. But he ran anyway. He reached a bend in the river about 50 feet ahead of the jagged rocks. It was now or never. If he missed, if he was too late, if the current was too strong, they'd both die. But if he did nothing, she'd definitely die, and he'd have to live with it. Another Tommy, another failure, another ghost. The invisible boy threw himself into the abyss. Hitting the water was like being struck by a freight train made of glass and ice and darkness. The shock of the 50-degree river punched the air straight out of Declan's lungs in a violent exhalation that left him gasping. His vision went white, then black, then white again. His body seized every muscle, locking up simultaneously. The numbing temperature paralyzed every nerve ending. His heart stuttered, missing a beat, then another. The current grabbed him immediately with hands like iron, dragging him under into a world of dark, chaotic violence where up and down ceased to exist. He couldn't see. The water was murky with sediment, dark as oil. Couldn't breathe. His lungs were screaming for air they couldn't have. Couldn't think. The cold was shutting down his brain function by function. Swim. The word cut through the panic like a knife through flesh. You have to swim or you die here, right now. Declan kicked violently, fighting the current that wanted to drag him to the bottom, fighting his own body that wanted to give up. He broke the surface with a gasping, choking breath that was half water, half air. The river tasted like silt and copper and death. He spun in the swirling chaos, disoriented, trying to find the surface, trying to find her. A faint choking sound came from his left, 10 yards away, maybe 15. The girl was barely staying afloat. Her waterlogged pink raincoat dragged her down like an anchor, the fabric heavy with water pulling her under. Her face was pale blue, the color of a corpse. Her eyes were wide with a terror so pure, so absolute, it made Declan's chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with the glacial water filling his lungs. She was going under again. Her mouth opened. Water rushed in. Declan angled his body toward her, fighting the current with every ounce of strength he had left. Every stroke was agony. His arms felt like lead weights, like they were made of concrete. His legs cramped from the cold, the muscles seizing. But he pushed. He pushed because he couldn't let her die. Not her. Not this child who probably had a family waiting at home, who probably had a warm bed and people who loved her. Not someone who actually had a life waiting for them. Just as the current ripped her toward the jagged edge of Devil's Tooth, Declan lunged forward with everything he had. His fingers brushed the slick material of the raincoat. He missed. The girl slipped beneath the dark water like a stone, like she'd never existed at all. No, no, no. Declan dove without thinking, without hesitating, even though diving meant giving up his tenuous grip on the surface meant risking everything. The water was murky, filled with swirling sediment and debris branches and leaves and trash carried by the flood. He opened his eyes, even though the cold stung them so badly, it felt like someone was pouring acid directly onto his eyeballs. He couldn't see anything but shadows, dark shapes moving in darker water. He thrashed his arms through the blackness, feeling for anything, anyone. Panic clawed at his throat with razor claws. His lungs screamed for oxygen, burning, begging, threatening to open his mouth and suck in water. Just a few more seconds. Hold on, hold on. His hand struck something soft, an arm. Declan grabbed the girl's small wrist and locked his fingers around it with a grip that would have broken bones if he'd had the strength, if he'd been anything other than a starving 17-year-old who weighed barely more than she did. He kicked upward with everything he had left, with strength he didn't know he possessed, with pure desperation. His vision was tunneling dark edges, creeping in from all sides. His body was shutting down, going into shock. But he kicked. They broke the surface, 3 feet from the rocks, 3 feet from death. Declan pulled the little girl against his chest, wrapping his left arm around her waist in a grip that nothing short of death itself was going to break. She was limp in his arms, a dead weight, her small body cold and unresponsive. I got you, he sputtered, coughing up river water that burned his throat. His voice was raw, barely recognizable. I got you. Don't let go. Please don't let go. The child was limp, coughing weakly, water pouring from her nose and mouth. Her tiny hands clutched his soaked hoodie with whatever strength she had left. But the fight wasn't over. Not even close. The current was slamming them toward the boulders with unstoppable force, the river determined to finish what it started. Declan could see the jagged edges rushing at them like teeth, like the river was a living thing that wanted to consume them both. He turned his body at the last second, putting his back between the rocks, and the girl making himself the shield. Crack! Declan's right shoulder slammed into the stone with the full force of the river behind it. Thousands of pounds of pressure concentrated into a single point of impact. White-hot pain, exploded down his arm and across his collarbone like lightning, like someone had shoved a red-hot poker through his joint. A scream caught in his throat, trapped there by the water flooding his mouth, but he didn't release his grip on the girl. He'd die before he let go. The impact spun them around like toys, pushing them out of the main channel and into a slightly slower eddy near the muddy bank. Kick. Just keep kicking. Don't stop. Don't you dare stop. His right arm was useless, hanging at a wrong angle, the pain so intense his vision blurred and doubled. But he used his legs, kicking desperately, fighting the undertow that desperately wanted to drag them back into the deep back to Devil's Tooth to finish the job. Inch by agonizing inch, he propelled them toward the shore. His brain was telling him to let go to sleep, to stop fighting, that he'd done enough. Not enough. Never enough. Just 10 more feet. His knees scraped against submerged gravel. The pain was distant, now muffled. Ground. Solid ground. Using the last reserves of strength in his body, reserves he didn't know existed. Declan hauled himself up onto the thick mud of the riverbank, dragging the waterlogged child with him. He collapsed onto his back, staring up at the gray sky that was spinning, tilting. His chest heaved violently, each breath a struggle. Rain pelted his face like tiny hammers. He couldn't feel his hands, couldn't feel his feet, couldn't feel anything except the agonizing throb in his shoulder and the overwhelming, crushing exhaustion that threatened to pull him under into darkness. He lay there for 3 seconds, maybe 4, letting his body believe it was over. Then reality snapped him back with the force of a slap. The girl. Declan forced himself to roll over, every muscle protesting. The little girl in the pink raincoat was lying on her back in the mud a few feet away. Her eyes were closed, her lips were a terrifying shade of blue, the color of a frozen corpse. Her skin was gray. She wasn't moving. She wasn't coughing. She wasn't breathing. No, 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 not after everything, not after this. Declan dragged himself over to her, his numb fingers fumbling with the zipper of the heavy waterlogged raincoat. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the metal pole. He finally got it open, spreading the coat wide. "Hey," he croaked. His voice was barely a whisper, his throat raw from screaming and swallowing the river water. "Hey, kid, wake up. Please wake up." He placed 2 shaking fingers against her neck, pressing down on the carotid artery. His hands were trembling so violently from the cold he could barely feel her skin. He pressed harder, searching desperately for a pulse. There. It was faint. So faint he almost missed it, like a butterfly's wing against his fingertips. But it was there. Her heart was still fighting. She wasn't breathing, but her heart hadn't given up. Declan's mind raced back to a high school health class he'd sat in 3 years ago. A lifetime ago. Before Harlan. Before the streets. Before Tommy. Before he became a ghost. The teacher had been a former paramedic, passionate about CPR, making them all practice on dummies until they could do it in their sleep. Tilt the head back, clear the airway, check for obstructions, compressions, rescue breaths. Don't stop until they breathe or help arrives. He tilted her small chin back, gently opening her airway. He looked in her mouth, making sure nothing was blocking it. Clear. He pinched her tiny nose between his thumb and forefinger, sealed his cracked lips over hers and breathed. Not too hard, just enough. Her small chest rose, her rib cage expanding. He pulled back, watching, praying. Nothing. She didn't breathe on her own. He placed the heel of his left hand on the center of her chest, his right arm useless and screaming. He began pushing. 30 compressions. The teacher's voice in his head. Push hard, push fast, at least 2 inches deep. 100 to 120 compressions per minute. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Come on, kid. Breathe. Please, God, please don't take her. Please don't let me fail again. 10, 11, 12. His broken shoulder screamed in agony with every compression, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. 13, 14, 15. He was covered in mud and blood and river water, dying from hypothermia himself, completely alone on the edge of the world, fighting a war against death for a child whose name he didn't even know. 28, 29, 30. He breathed into her mouth again. 2 breaths. Her chest rose and fell. Nothing. More compressions. 1, 2, 3. His vision was blurring. 4, 5, 6. He was crying out, tears mixing with the rain on his face. 7, 8, 9. Oh, yeah. Above them on the highway that ran parallel to the river trail, a low guttural vibration began to build. It started as a distant hum like thunder on the horizon, then grew into a heavy rhythmic pounding that seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. But Declan didn't hear it. The rushing water and his own panicked heartbeat and the voice in his head screaming, "Don't stop, don't stop, don't stop," drowned out everything else. 28, 29, 30. He pushed on her chest again, his left arm trembling with exhaustion. "Breathe, please breathe." Suddenly, the little girl's chest lurched violently. She rolled to her side without warning, and water erupted from her mouth in a violent hacking torrent. River water and mucus and bile poured out of her in waves. She gasped, her whole body convulsing, sucking in a massive, ragged breath of air that rattled in her chest. And then she began to cry. It was the most beautiful sound Declan had ever heard. He slumped backward into the mud, a hysterical sob escaping his lips, his whole body shaking. Relief crashed over him like a wave so powerful it nearly knocked him unconscious. "You're okay, Pa," he whispered, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely form the words. "You're okay, you're breathing, you're alive." He pulled the shivering, crying girl into his lap with his good arm, wrapping himself around her to share whatever meager body heat he had left, which wasn't much. She buried her wet face into his muddy hoodie, her small hands grabbing fistfuls of the fabric, sobbing uncontrollably. She was crying for her dad, calling for him between sobs. That was when the thunder arrived. The vibration shook the loose pebbles on the riverbank, making them dance. Declan looked up, blinking through the rain that was still falling through lighter now. Up on the ridge where the walking trail met the access road, headlights began to pierce the gloom. Not one or two, dozens. The deafening synchronized roar of V-twin engines drowned out the storm, drowning out the river, drowning out everything. A procession of motorcycles pulled off the road in tight formation and skidded to a violent halt along the muddy ridge overlooking the river. They were enormous custom Harley-Davidsons, their chrome catching what little light the gray sky offered, reflecting it back like mirrors. The riders killed the engines in perfect unison, and in the sudden, eerie quiet that followed, the only sounds were the hissing of rain against hot exhaust pipes and the heavy thud of boots hitting the ground. Declan's heart stopped. There were at least 40 men, maybe more. They were imposing figures, massive and rugged, moving with a frantic, aggressive energy down the slope toward the riverbank. They wore thick leather cuts vests adorned with patches and pins. But it was the patch on the back that made the blood freeze in Declan's already numbing veins. A winged death's head, skull with wings spread wide, the Hell's Angels. "Violet?" A voice roared across the water, across the mud, across the distance. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated panic, a father's terror-given voice, completely at odds with the terrifying appearance of the men storming down the hill. A giant of a man shoved his way to the front of the pack, pushing others aside. He was easily 6'4", broad-shouldered, like a bear with a rain-soaked beard and wild eyes that scanned the riverbank desperately. His leather cut bore a president patch on the front, stitched in white thread, right above a name patch that read Reaper in Gothic letters. He was looking for someone, and he found her. Reaper's eyes locked onto the muddy bank below. He saw the golden retriever first pacing and whining at the top of the slope, and then he saw them. A filthy, emaciated teenager in rags covered in mud and blood, sitting in the freezing rain, clutching a 7-year-old girl in a pink raincoat. To Reaper, it didn't look like a rescue. It looked like every father's worst nightmare. Hey! Reaper bellowed, his voice echoing off the water like a gunshot. Hey, get away from her! He didn't walk down the embankment. He didn't hesitate. He slid and leaped down the dangerous slope like a man possessed, completely ignoring the treacherous footing, the mud, the rocks. Behind him, 5 other bikers charged down the hill, without question, men with road names like Grit and Wrench and Blade, all of them moving with the same violent urgency, the same protective rage. Declan froze in absolute primal terror. He was shivering so hard his teeth were clicking together like castanets. His shoulder was in blinding agony, waves of pain radiating down his arm. But the fear of the wall of muscle and leather and fury charging at him overrode it all. He tried to speak, to explain, to tell them he'd saved her, but his jaw was locked tight from the cold and the shock. No words would come. Before Declan could even raise his good hand in defense, before he could move, Reaper was upon him. A massive, calloused hand shot out and grabbed the collar of Declan's soaked hoodie, the fabric bunching in an iron grip. Reaper violently yanked him backward, ripping him away from the girl with terrifying strength. Declan was thrown hard into the mud, his bad shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. He screamed a raw sound of pure agony that tore from his throat as white-hot pain exploded through his entire body. A heavy combat boot came down on his chest, pinning him to the ground, crushing the air from his lungs. "What the hell did you do to her?" A biker with a scar across his nose shouted, his face twisted with rage. He pulled a heavy hunting knife from a sheath on his belt, the blade gleaming even in the gray light. "What did you do?" Reaper dropped to his knees in the mud, frantically scooping his crying daughter into his massive tattooed arms. He held her against his chest, his hands running over her, checking for injuries. "Violet, baby, I got you. Daddy's here. Daddy's got you." His voice cracked with emotion, with fear, with relief. "Are you hurt? Did he hurt you? Did that piece of shit touch you?" He looked over his shoulder at Declan, and his eyes were flashing with a terrifying, murderous rage that promised violence, promised death. "Get him up," Reaper snarled to the other bikers. "Get him on his feet." 2 bikers grabbed Declan's arms and hauled him upright. His legs couldn't support his weight. They buckled immediately. He dangled between the 2 men like a scarecrow, like a corpse coughing up river water, shivering violently enough that his whole body shook. His lips were completely blue. His skin was gray-white, the color of death. He looked like he was already halfway to the grave. I, I, Declan stammered through chattering teeth. He bit his own tongue, tasted blood. "River, she fell." "Shut your mouth!" the biker with the knife barked, shaking him roughly. The blade came up near Declan's throat. "You grabbed her on the trail, huh? You some kind of predator. You trying to take her?" "No," Declan choked out the word, barely audible. Tears of pain and fear and exhaustion streamed down his face, cutting tracks through the mud. She fell in the water. I saved." Reaper was holding Violet tight, his enormous hands dwarfing her small frame. She was shaking violently, her clothes completely soaked with river water, her lips blue. It finally registered to the towering biker that the kid they were holding was also soaking wet, missing his shoes, covered in mud and blood, dying from hypothermia. Violet stopped sobbing just enough to pull her face away from her father's leather vest. She looked at the 2 giant bikers holding the terrified, shivering teenager who looked more like a skeleton than a person. "Daddy, stop," Violet cried, her small voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Daddy, you're hurting him." Reaper froze, his whole body going still. "Violet, baby, what did he do to you? Tell Daddy what happened." Violet pointed a small, trembling finger at Declan, water still dripping from her hair. "He didn't hurt me, Daddy. I didn't listen. I chased Max down the hill, even though you told me not to, and I fell." Her voice broke into sobs again. "I fell in the big water. It was so cold, Daddy. It pulled me down. It was eating me." The air on the riverbank suddenly grew incredibly still. The only sounds were the pouring rain and varlets crying, and the river rushing past oblivious to the drama unfolding on its banks. Reaper's eyes moved from his daughter to the violent churning rapids of the Willamette just yards away, then to the jagged rocks of Devil's Tooth barely visible through the rain. He saw the slide marks in the mud where she'd gone in. He saw the sheer raw terror of the river, the power of it. He understood in that instant what the current would do to a 7-year-old child, what it would have done. He jumped into that. Violet whimpered, burying her face back in his chest, her small voice muffled. I was sinking and it was dark and I couldn't breathe and he caught me. He caught me and pulled me out. The biker holding the knife slowly lowered his hand, the blade dropping to his side. The two men holding Declan up loosened their iron grips, looking at each other in sudden stunned shock. One of them muttered, Jesus Christ. Reaper stood up slowly, cradling his daughter in one arm like she weighed nothing. He walked over to Declan, his boots squelching in the mud. He was so tall, he blocked out what little light there was. The terrifying rage that had contorted his bearded face a moment ago was gone, replaced by an expression of profound, stunned realization, of understanding, of something else that might have been respect. He looked at the kid, really looked at him for the first time. He saw a boy barely 17 years old, weighing maybe 130 pounds soaking wet, and that was being generous. He saw the bruised, battered face with cheekbones that stuck out too far, the duct-taped clothes that hung off a skeletal frame, the agonizing way his right shoulder was slumping unnaturally, clearly dislocated or worse, the bare feet cut and bleeding. He saw a kid who had absolutely nothing in the world, who looked like he'd been starving for months, who had just thrown himself into a deadly river in October to save a child he didn't know. You? Reaper's voice cracked, the sound shocking coming from such an imposing man. The terrifying chapter president of the Hells Angels suddenly sounded like a terrified father who'd just gotten his daughter back. You pulled her out. Declan couldn't speak anymore. The adrenaline that had been holding him together was crashing hard. The hypothermia was reaching critical levels, his core temperature dangerously low. His eyes rolled back, slightly unfocused. His knees buckled completely. Hey! Reaper shouted, reaching out with his free hand just as Declan collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. The massive biker caught the boy before he hit the mud, cradling him with surprising gentleness. Declan was ice cold to the touch, colder than the rain, colder than in the river. His skin felt like marble. Doc! Reaper roared up the hill toward the other bikers, his voice carrying over everything. Doc, get the hell down here with the trauma kit right now. Move! He looked at the biker with the scar across his nose, the one who'd pulled the knife. Blade, get your heated jacket off. Wrap the kid. He's dying of hypothermia. Grick, get the thermal blankets from your saddlebag. Wrench, call 911. Get an ambulance rolling. The aggression vanished instantly, replaced by military-like efficiency and precision. The men who had been ready to end Declan's life 60 seconds ago were now working to save it. Blade stripped off his thick, heated leather vest and wrapped it around Declan's shivering frame. Another biker pressed a thermal emergency blanket around his legs. A third was checking his pulse, his breathing. Doc, an older biker with graying hair and the steady hands of someone who'd done field medicine in war zones, scrambled down the bank with a tackle box full of medical supplies. He immediately started barking orders, checking Declan's vitals, his pupils, his core temperature. Reaper held his daughter tight with one arm, looking down at the unconscious, homeless teenager who had just handed him back his entire world. His little girl, his everything. The ghost under the bridge was no longer invisible. You're not dying today, kid, Reaper whispered, his jaw set with determination as the club medics worked frantically to stabilize Declan. Not on our watch, not after what you just did. Coming back to consciousness was like clawing through layers of thick, dark wool. First came the smell. It wasn't the damp, rotting odor of the riverbank, that distinctive combination of algae and decay and human waste that had become his normal. It wasn't the stale exhaust fumes of the overpass. The constant reminder that he lived beneath a highway where thousands of people passed overhead every day without knowing he existed. It was the rich scent of old leather worn smooth by decades of use. Tobacco smoke, the kind that clings to everything and everyone. Strong coffee brewing somewhere nearby, and the sharp medicinal tang of rubbing alcohol, the smell of care of treatment of someone trying to heal. Then came the heat. It radiated around him thick and heavy, an impossibly wonderful seeping deep into bones that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Warmth that didn't come from huddling over a pathetic lighter flame or stealing a few minutes under the hand dryer in a public restroom. Real warmth, deliberate warmth, the kind that said someone cared whether he lived or died. Declan was lying on something impossibly soft, a mattress, an actual mattress with sheets that didn't smell like mildew or urine or rain. Sheets that smelled clean like detergent, like someone had washed them specifically for him. A pillow that wasn't a wadded-up jacket or a pile of newspapers. A real pillow. His eyes fluttered open, slowly, reluctantly, like they'd forgotten how. The light was dim, cast by iron lamps bolted to wood-paneled walls. Not harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered. Soft, warm light that didn't hurt to look at. The room was small, windowless, with concrete walls painted a faded olive green. Motorcycle posters hung crooked on the walls, vintage ads for Harley-Davidson from the 1960s and 70s. A small space heater hummed contentedly in the corner, glowing orange like a tiny sun. Panic hit him like a fist to the chest. Where was he? How did he get here? Where was his stuff? The bridge. He needed to get back to the bridge before someone took his spot, before the city cleanup crew came through before. Declan tried to scramble backward, his survival instincts screaming at him to run, to hide, to get away before whatever this was turned bad. It always turned bad eventually. But a sudden blinding agony tore through his right shoulder like someone had shoved a railroad spike through the joint. White-hot pain exploded down his arm and across his collarbone. It pinned him to the bed with a gasp that came out more like a whimper, a sound he hated himself for making. Easy, kid, don't move. A hand pressed firmly against his uninjured shoulder, pushing him back down into the mattress with surprising gentleness. Declan blinked rapidly, his vision clearing, to reveal a man sitting on a metal stool beside the bed. He was older, maybe late 50s or early 60s, his face lined like a well-worn road map. Deep creases around his eyes and mouth spoke of a life lived hard but not without laughter. A graying beard, neatly trimmed, framed a mouth that had seen too many bar fights and probably won most of them. A pair of reading glasses perched on the end of a nose that had clearly been broken at least twice, maybe 3 times. He wore a black t-shirt that barely contained a still muscular frame, the kind of physique that came from decades of physical work, not from a gym. But draped over the chair next to him was a leather cut with the Hells Angels Death's Head patch on the back and a smaller patch on the front that read Doc in white thread. Your shoulder was dislocated. Doc said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sounded like it had been marinated in whiskey and cigarettes for 40 years. Subluxation of the glenohumeral joint, to be precise. I popped it back into place while you were unconscious. You're welcome, by the way. That shit hurts worse when you're awake. He paused, studying Declan's face. You also have a torn rotator cuff, some ligament damage, and what I'm pretty sure is a hairline fracture in the collarbone from hitting those rocks. You won't be throwing any footballs for a while. Doc nodded toward Declan's right arm, which was immobilized in a heavy sling strapped tight against his chest with Velcro straps and medical tape. The kind of professional immobilization that spoke of real medical training. You also had stage 2 hypothermia when they brought you in. Doc continued, his tone matter of fact but not unkind. Core temperature was 89 degrees. Another few minutes in that river and you'd be in stage 3, which means you'd be dead. We've been pumping warm IV fluids into you for the last 6 hours. Normal saline heated to 98.6 degrees. You should be feeling significantly less like a popsicle by now. Declan looked down at himself for the first time. He was wearing clean, oversized gray sweatpants that were definitely not his, a thick flannel shirt, in red and black plaid that smelled like fabric softener. The sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, revealing arms that were far too thin, the bones visible beneath pale skin. An IV line snaked into his left hand, taped down with medical precision, connected to a bag of clear fluid hanging from a metal stand. 6 hours. He'd been unconscious for 6 hours. Anything could have happened. They could have done anything. Where Declan's voice came out like sandpaper scraping against wood. His throat felt like he'd swallowed broken glass. He swallowed hard, wincing at the pain, and tried again. Where am I? Safe. A new voice boomed from the doorway, deep and commanding. Reaper stepped into the small room, and the sheer size of the man seemed to suck the oxygen out of the space. He had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe. He wasn't wearing his leather cut now, just a black thermal shirt that highlighted sleeves absolutely covered in intricate faded tattoos. Old school ink, prison quality, the kind you got from someone who knew what they were doing but wasn't working in a licensed shop. He held a steaming ceramic mug in one enormous hand and a plate piled high with food in the other. "You're in the clubhouse," Reaper said, his voice gentler than it had been on the riverbank, but still carrying the weight of absolute authority. He walked over and set the plate carefully on the small nightstand beside the bed. Declan's eyes went wide. It was a steak, an actual steak, thick and perfectly cooked, medium rare from the look of it. A mountain of mashed potatoes swimming in rich brown gravy. 2 buttered rolls that were still steaming. The smell hit Declan's starving stomach so hard, it cramped painfully, a sharp twist that made him gasp. Saliva flooded his mouth instantly. His stomach growled so loudly it was audible across the room. "Eat slowly." Reaper continued, settling his considerable bulk into a chair that groaned under his weight. "Your body isn't used to real food. You wolf that down too fast, and you'll just throw it all back up. Trust me, seen it happen." Declan stared at the food, then at the imposing biker. The memories of the river came crashing back into his mind in disjointed fragments. The icy water stealing his breath, the pink raincoat bobbing in the current, the jagged rocks rushing at them, the wall of bikers storming down the muddy bank like an army, the knife at his throat, the terror, the absolute certainty that he was about to die, the little girl. "Violet," Declan whispered, his voice trembling with sudden fear. Did she? "She's asleep upstairs," Reaper said, and his tough, intimidating exterior cracked for just a fraction of a second. Something soft showed through something vulnerable. "My old lady is with her, Elle, my wife. She's got a mild fever from being in that water, but Doc says she's going to be fine. Her lungs are clear, no water in them because of what you did." Reaper leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his massive hands clasped together. He looked at Declan with an intensity that it made the teenager want to shrink back into the mattress to disappear. "Because of you," Reaper repeated, making sure the words landed. Declan looked away, unable to hold the man's gaze. He didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to process the fact that the same man who had thrown him into the mud and put a boot on his chest 3 hours ago was now sitting here looking at him like he'd done something heroic instead of just desperately stupid. Like he was someone worth saving instead of just another piece of street trash. "I don't know you, kid," Reaper said slowly, his dark eyes scanning Declan's bruised face, taking in every detail. The hollow cheeks, the dark circles under his eyes, so deep they looked like bruises. The split lip, the scar on his chin. "I don't know your name. I don't know why you were under that bridge. I don't know why you look like you haven't eaten a square meal since the Obama administration." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "But I know this. You went into a river that would have killed a grown man in full health to pull my daughter out. You took the hit on those rocks so she wouldn't. You gave her CPR when her heart was still beating, but her lungs had stopped. You saved her life." Declan swallowed hard, his throat clicking. "She was just a kid," he said quietly. "I couldn't just watch. I couldn't just stand there and let her die." "A lot of people would have," Reaper countered, his voice quiet but firm. A lot of people would have run to find a phone, waited for help to arrive, called 911 and hoped for the best. Hell, most people wouldn't have even seen her go in. You didn't just see her, you jumped. That takes something most people don't have. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy silver Zippo lighter, the kind that's been carried for decades, worn smooth by constant use. He flipped it open and closed the metallic clack, filling the silence like a metronome. Click, clack, click, clack. "My name is Jackson Stone," Reaper said. "Everyone calls me Reaper. Have for the last 25 years. I'm the president of this charter, the Oregon chapter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club." He tilted his head slightly, studying Declan. "What's your name, son?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the cigarette someone was smoking in another room. Declan's first instinct screamed at him to lie, to give a fake name, to protect himself the way he'd been protecting himself for 19 months on the streets. Never give your real name. Never tell the truth. Never let anyone know who you really are, because that's how they find you. That's how they hurt you. But something in the way Reaper was looking at him, something in the warmth of the room and the food on the nightstand, and the IV pumping life-saving fluids into his veins, and the fact that he was still alive when he had every reason not to be, made the truth slip out before he could stop it. "Declan," he said softly. "Declan Thorne." "Declan Thorne," Reaper repeated slowly, like he was committing it to memory. "All right, Declan, here's how this is going to work. You're going to eat that food, slowly, then you're going to sleep. Doc's going to check on you every few hours, and nobody gets through that door without my say-so. Understand?" As Reaper started to stand up, Declan spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand. I can't stay here. If they find me..." Reaper stopped mid-rise. He settled back into the chair, slowly, deliberately. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier, charged with a different kind of energy. "If who finds you, Declan?" His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. Declan clamped his mouth shut so hard his jaw ached. He'd already said too much. Way too much. The paranoia of the streets, the only shield he'd had for 19 months, slammed back into place like a steel door. Never tell them. Never give them ammunition. Never let anyone know where you came from or where you're going. Reaper stared at him for a long, calculating moment. His eyes, dark brown and sharp, missed nothing. He saw the fear, the panic, the walls going up. "All right," he said, finally standing up fully this time. The Zippo vanished back into his pocket with a soft clink. "You don't have to tell me now, but you're staying put until you're healed. That's not negotiable. You saved my daughter's life. That means something in this world. It means everything." He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "Eat," he ordered softly, "then sleep. We'll talk tomorrow." The door closed with a quiet click. The lock didn't engage. Declan listened carefully, but he heard footsteps settle just outside in the hallway. Heavy boots on concrete. Someone was standing guard or keeping him prisoner. He wasn't sure which. Doc checked the IV one more time, adjusting the drip rate slightly. "Get some rest, kid. Your body needs it. I'll be back in a few hours to check your vitals." He paused at the door, glancing back. "For what it's worth, what you did out there, that took guts. More guts than most men twice your size would have. Sleep well." Then Declan was alone. But he didn't feel safe. Safety was a lie, a trap. Safety was the thing people told you right before they ripped it away, before they hurt you, before they sent you back. He waited until Doc's footsteps faded completely. Then he stared at the plate of food for a full minute, his stomach growling, his mouth watering, but his brain screaming that it might be poisoned, might be drugged, might be a trick. Finally, hunger won. He picked up the fork with his left hand. His right arm was useless in the sling and cut a small piece of steak. He brought it to his mouth slowly, half expecting it to taste wrong, to be rotten, to be anything other than what it appeared to be. It was perfect, seasoned with salt and pepper and garlic, cooked exactly right. The most delicious thing he'd tasted in months. He ate 3 bites before his stomach rebelled, violently cramping so hard he doubled over. Too much too fast. His body didn't know what to do with real protein anymore. He forced himself to slow down, taking tiny bites, chewing thoroughly, waiting between each one. By the time he'd finished half the steak and a few spoonfuls of mashed potatoes, exhaustion pulled him under like a riptide, sudden and irresistible. He slept. For the first time in 19 months, he slept in a real bed without waking every hour to check if someone was coming, if the cops were doing a sweep, if another homeless person was trying to steal his stuff. He slept deeply, dreamlessly, his body finally given permission to rest. When Declan woke again, pale gray light was seeping under the door. Morning, he could hear the muffled sounds of the club house waking up around him, boots on concrete, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines being started, then idling, then shut off, the sharp hiss of an espresso machine, the clink of dishes, male voices low and gruff, talking and laughing about something. His shoulder throbbed with a deep, persistent ache, but the sharp, blinding pain from yesterday was gone. The IV was gone too. Someone had removed it while he slept, the tape carefully peeled away, a small Band-Aid over the puncture site. On the nightstand next to the now empty plate was a pair of thick wool socks and a note written in blocky handwriting with a black marker. Bathroom is 2 doors down on the left. Take your time. Grit is outside if you need anything. Reaper. Declan sat up slowly, testing his body. Everything hurt, but it was a manageable hurt, the kind you could work through. He pulled on the wool socks. They were warm, clean, expensive, and stood swaying slightly. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else. 19 months of malnutrition and one near-death experience had left him hollow, fragile. He made it to the bathroom, relieved himself, and stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. He looked like a ghost, like something that should be dead but wasn't. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. Hollow eyes with dark circles so deep they looked like someone had punched him repeatedly. His hair was still damp somehow, sticking up in wild, uneven tufts. The flannel shirt hung off his frame like a sail with no wind, the fabric pooling around his thin arms. This was what survival looked like. This was what giving up everything looked like. Declan splashed cold water on his face, the shock of it helping him focus. He dried off with a surprisingly soft towel and made his way back to the room. But he didn't go inside. Instead, curiosity and a desperate need to understand where he was pulled him down the hallway, moving quietly toward the sound of voices. The clubhouse opened up into a large common room that took Declan's breath away. It was huge, easily 50 feet long. A massive bar ran along one wall, the kind you'd see in an old saloon, dark wood polished to a shine. Bottles of whiskey, vodka, tequila, and bourbon lined up like soldiers on glass shelves. Pool tables dominated the center of the room, the felt worn but clean. Worn leather couches formed a semicircle around a flat-screen TV mounted on the wall, currently showing ESPN with the sound off. The morning light filtered through high windows, cutting through the haze of cigarette smoke that seemed permanently baked into the air. Photos covered the walls, rally photos, ride photos. Brothers who were no longer with them, their faces immortalized in black and white. 5 bikers sat around one of the tables playing cards and drinking coffee from mugs the size of soup bowls. They looked up when Declan appeared in the doorway, conversations stopping mid-sentence. One of them, a bald man with a heavily tattooed face and arms the size of tree trunks, set down his cards and stood up. The tattoos covered every visible inch of skin, his scalp, his face, his neck, his arms. Skulls and flames and words and languages Declan didn't recognize. Grit. "Kids awake!" Grit called over his shoulder. Then to Declan, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You look like 10 pounds of shit in a 5-pound bag." "Feel worse," Declan muttered, his voice still raw. Grit grunted, which might have been a laugh. "Reaper's in his office. Wants to see you when you're up." He gestured toward a heavy oak door at the end of the room with a hand covered in ring tattoos. "You need anything, water, coffee?" Declan shook his head, not trusting his voice. He walked to the oak door, his socked feet silent on the concrete floor, his stomach twisted with anxiety. He thought about running. The loading dock doors were probably somewhere past the garage he could see through an open doorway. He could slip out, disappear back into the streets before anyone noticed, before they asked too many questions, before they called the cops or social services. But then what? Back to the bridge, back to the cold, in the mud and the slow grinding, certainty that he wouldn't make it through the winter. Back to being invisible, Declan raised his left hand and knocked on the door. "Come in." Reaper's office was a study in controlled chaos. The walls were lined with club memorabilia that told the story of decades. Photos of rides and rallies dating back to the 1980s. Frame patches from other charters. California, Nevada, Washington, Arizona. A vintage Harley-Davidson sign. Newspaper clippings and frames, some yellowed with age. An enormous mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface covered in ledgers, maps, printed emails, and a laptop that looked out of place among the vintage aesthetic. Reaper sat behind the desk, reading glasses, perched on his nose, a fresh mug of coffee steaming beside him. He looked up when Declan entered and gestured to a worn leather chair in front of the desk. "Sit down." Declan sat. The chair was deep and comfortable and swallowed him whole. Reaper closed the ledger he'd been reading and folded his hands on the desk. For a long moment, he just studied Declan with the kind of quiet intensity that made it hard to hold eye contact, like he was reading something written on Declan's face that nobody else could see. "You're a runner," Reaper finally said. "It wasn't a question." "I get it. Survival instinct, street smarts, always have an exit strategy. But out there right now, you're a liability to yourself. You're malnourished. You're injured. Winter's coming and it's going to be brutal this year. The meteorologists are calling for record cold. So we're going to have a conversation and you're going to tell me the truth, not because I'm demanding it, because I'm offering you something you haven't had in a long time." "What's that?" Declan asked warily. "A choice." Declan's hands clenched in his lap. "I just want to leave, please. I didn't ask for any of this. I just want to go back under the bridge. That's my spot. I know how to survive there." "You're not going back to the mud," Reaper said flatly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You saved my blood, my daughter, my only child. That means you're under my roof until you're healed, until you have gained back some weight, until you're strong enough to make a real decision about your future, not a decision based on fear and exhaustion." "And then what?" Declan's voice cracked. "You just let me walk out. Nobody ever just lets people walk away." "That's your choice to make," Reaper said evenly, "when you're healed. But you told me last night, you said, if they find me. Who's looking for you, Declan?" The silence stretched so long it felt suffocating. Declan could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He could hear the clock on the wall ticking. He could hear someone laughing in the common room. He looked down at his lap. His hands were shaking. He hadn't talked about Victor Harlan out loud in 19 months. Saying the name felt dangerous, like summoning a demon, like opening a door that should stay closed forever. But something about the way Reaper was looking at him, not with pity, not with judgment, but with a kind of calm, patient authority that said he'd heard worse, seen worse, survived worse, made the dam crack. "His name is Victor Harlan," Declan whispered. Reaper's brow furrowed. He pulled a yellow legal pad toward him and picked up a pen, clicking it twice. "Who is he?" "He was my foster father in Seattle." The words felt like broken glass coming out of his throat, cutting him from the inside. Reaper didn't interrupt. He didn't react. He just waited, pen poised, giving Declan the space to continue. "I was put in the system when I was 12. Declan continued, his voice hollow and distant, like he was talking about someone else's life. "My mom died. Cancer, ovarian cancer. She fought it for 2 years, but it came back aggressive, and she didn't have insurance for the good treatments. I didn't have anyone else. No dad he left when I was a baby. No grandparents. No aunts or uncles. So I went into foster care." "And he beat you?" "It wasn't a question. Reaper had seen the scars on Declan's back when Doc was treating him. The kind of scars that came from a belt buckle swung with force repeatedly, methodically. Declan nodded slowly. He beat all of us. He had 3 other foster kids at any given time. The state paid him per kid. It was a business for him. But nobody ever checked on us. The social workers would visit once a month, scheduled visits, and Harlan would put on a whole show. Clean house, good food, smiling kids who were too scared to say anything because we knew what would happen after they left. Reaper's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He wrote the name Victor Harlan in block letters on the legal pad, then slowly drew a thick black circle around it. Then another circle, then another, pressing so hard the pen tore through the paper slightly. "Harlan, he's not some nobody," Declan said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "He's a prominent guy. He owns 3 construction companies in King County, big ones: Harlan Construction, Harlan Development, and Harlan Contracting. He plays golf with judges and city councilmen. He donates to the Police Benevolent Fund every year, has his picture in the paper shaking hands with the mayor. Whenever a kid tried to run, the cops would pick us up within a day or two and bring us right back to him. They thought we were just troubled teens acting out being ungrateful. Nobody believed us." Reaper set the pen down carefully. "Tell me about Tommy." Declan's head snapped up. "How do you know about Tommy?" "You said his name yesterday," Reaper said quietly, "when you were hypothermic, barely conscious. You kept saying, 'Not Tommy, not again, not Tommy.' Who is he?" Declan's eyes filled with tears that he angrily wiped away with his good hand. "Tommy was one of the other foster kids. He was 9 years old. He loved dinosaurs. Had this red backpack with a T-Rex on it that he carried everywhere. He couldn't pronounce the letter R, called me Dequin instead of Declan. He was a good kid, sweet, didn't deserve any of it." He took a shuddering breath. 2 years ago, Harlan came home drunk. Tommy had accidentally left a toy on the stairs, one of those little plastic dinosaurs. Harlan stepped on it in his socks, slipped, fell down 3 steps. Didn't even get hurt, but he was furious. He dragged Tommy to the top of the basement stairs and pushed him. Declan's voice broke completely. "Tommy fell all the way down concrete stairs, 15 steps, fractured skull, 3 broken ribs, punctured lung. He was in the ICU for 2 weeks. Harlan told the doctors Tommy fell playing in the yard, tripped over his backpack. They believed him because why wouldn't they? Respected businessman, pillar of the community. What happened when you tried to tell someone? I told Harlan I was going to the police, to the state, to anyone who would listen." Declan wiped his eyes again, angry at himself for crying. "He locked me in the basement, same basement where Tommy fell. He left me there for 5 days. No food, no water for the first 2 days. Just darkness and cold in the stairs where Tommy's blood had stained the concrete. The room was so quiet, Declan could hear his own ragged breathing. He'd come down once a day after that," Declan continued, "bring me a bottle of water and half a peanut butter sandwich. And he'd tell me exactly what would happen if I ever breathed a word. He said he'd make sure I disappeared into juvenile detention until I was 18. Said he had friends in the system who would make my life hell. Said nobody would ever believe a worthless ward of the state over a pillar of the community. And he was right. Nobody would. So you ran." "So I ran," Declan confirmed. "March 23rd of last year. I was 15, almost 16. I waited until he was gone to a business dinner, broke a window in my bedroom with a chair, cut myself pretty bad on the glass, but I didn't care. I climbed out, jumped down to the lawn, and ran. Hitched rides on I-5 heading south. Figured Portland was far enough away that he'd stop looking for me, that I could disappear here." Reaper sat back in his chair. He stared at the yellow legal pad for a long time at the name circled 3 times in angry black ink. Then he stood up, walked over to a metal cabinet, unlocked it with a key from his pocket, and pulled out a bottle of dark whiskey. Expensive whiskey, the kind with a label Declan didn't recognize. He poured 2 fingers into a heavy glass and downed it in one gulp, his throat working. You did the right thing, kid, Reaper finally said, his back still to Declan. You survived. That takes strength. More strength than most people have. Running was the only option you had. He turned around and the look in his eyes made the hairs on the back of Declan's neck stand up. It was a cold, calculating fury. The kind of anger that didn't explode, the kind that planned. Go back to your room, Reaper ordered softly. Grit will stand outside your door. You're safe here. That's not a request or a suggestion. That's a fact. What are you going to do? Declan asked nervously, his voice small. Reaper picked up his cell phone from the desk. I'm going to make a few phone calls to our Seattle charter. See what we can find out about Mr. Harlan. See if he's really as untouchable as he thinks he is. 3 days passed. The rain finally broke on the second day, leaving the Oregon landscape washed clean and bitterly cold. Inside the compound, Declan's world had shifted on its axis in ways he couldn't fully process, couldn't fully believe were real. He wasn't a ghost anymore. The men in the leather cuts, men who looked like they could kill you with their bare hands without breaking a sweat, treated him with a bizarre, unspoken reverence, like he was something precious, something worth protecting. Blade the biker with the scar across his nose, who had pulled a knife on him at the riverbank, showed up outside his door on the second morning. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there holding a cardboard box. Then he thrust it at Declan and walked away without a word. Inside were a brand new pair of heavy leather boots. Red Wings expensive, the real deal. A warm winter coat, 3 t-shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, and wool socks. Everything in approximately Declan's size. Doc checked on him 3 times a day, every 8 hours, like clockwork. He'd check Declan's shoulder rewrap, the sling, check his range of motion and administer pain medication, monitor his recovery with the precision of someone who had done serious field medicine. Maybe military, maybe something else. He never said, and Declan never asked. Stone Reaper's wife was the first woman Declan had really talked to in 19 months. She appeared in his doorway on day 2, carrying a tray with soup and fresh bread. She was in her early 40s with kind eyes the color of storm clouds, and graying blonde hair pulled back in a permanent ponytail secured with a simple black hair tie. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt and boots and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who ran this place as much as Reaper did, just in different ways. You need to eat more than once a day, she said, simply setting the tray on the nightstand. Your body is trying to heal. Can't do that on an empty tank. She sat down in the chair Reaper had occupied, uninvited but not unwelcome. I'm Elle, Reaper's old lady, Violet's mom. She paused, studying him. You saved my daughter's life. There aren't words for what that means to me, to us. But I'm not going to cry all over you or make this weird. I just want you to know that you're safe here, for as long as you need. Declan didn't know what to say to that. Thank you seemed inadequate. Eat, Elle said, gesturing to the soup. Then if you're feeling up to it, come upstairs. Violet's been asking about you. Wants to thank you herself, but only if you're ready. No pressure. She left as quietly as she'd arrived. Declan ate the soup slowly. It was homemade, rich with vegetables and chunks of chicken. The bread was fresh, still warm, with butter that melted on contact. He couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for him. Violet came to visit him on the afternoon of the 3rd day. She appeared in his doorway wearing purple leggings with cartoon unicorns and a matching sweatshirt, her blonde hair pulled back in 2 pigtails secured with purple scrunchies. She looked healthy, alive, the color back in her cheeks. She walked right up to Declan, who was sitting on one of the couches in the common room trying to figure out how to hold a coffee mug with one hand, and she presented him with a piece of paper. It was a drawing, crayons on white construction paper. A stick figure boy with spiky brown hair fighting against a giant blue squiggly river. In the river was a smaller stick figure with yellow hair and a pink triangle for a raincoat. The sun was shining in the corner, At the top, in crooked letters that ran uphill, it said, "Thank you, Declan." Declan stared at the drawing, his throat tightening. "You're a superhero," Violet said matter-of-factly, like this was just an obvious fact. "Mom says superheroes don't wear capes. They just do the right thing, even when it's scary. Were you scared?" Declan nodded slowly. "Very scared." "But you jumped anyway." "Yeah. That's what makes you a superhero." She hugged him, then quick and fierce, her small arms wrapping around his waist. Then she pulled back, smiled, and ran back upstairs where Elle was waiting at the top of the steps. For the first time in his entire life, Declan felt the terrifying, fragile sensation of belonging. But out in the real world, ghosts rarely stayed buried. It was Friday afternoon of the third day. Declan was sitting on a stool in the clubhouse garage watching Grit and a younger prospect, a kid maybe 20 years old trying to earn his way into the club, tear down an engine block from a 1980s shovelhead. The smell of motor oil and degreaser was strangely comforting, mechanical and honest. Then the blast of an air horn shattered the peace. Grit immediately dropped his wrench with a clang. The prospect jogged over to the heavy steel door that led to the compound courtyard, peering through the security slit, a narrow viewing slot installed specifically for this purpose. "Grit," the prospect said, his voice tight with tension. "We got company at the main gate. Black SUV, Cadillac Escalade, tinted windows, no front plate." "Cops," Grit asked, already moving wiping grease on a rag. "Negative. No lights, no markings. Looks like private muscle. Corporate security, maybe?" Declan's blood ran completely cold. The half-eaten sandwich Elle had brought him dropped from his hand to the concrete floor. Harlan. It had to be Harlan. He'd found him somehow. Maybe tracked him through his social security number. Maybe had connections with Portland PD. Maybe. He scrambled off the stool, his bad shoulder throbbing. "I have to hide. I have to go. If they find me." "Hey, stop!" Grit barked, his voice sharp but not unkind. He grabbed Declan by the good arm, his grip firm but careful. "You ain't running anywhere. You're with us now. That means something." Grit hit a button on the radio clipped to his belt. "Reaper, we got uninvited guests at the front gate. Black SUV, private security look." "I see them on the monitors," Reaper's voice crackled back, deadly calm. The kind of calm that came before violence. "Stall them. I'm coming down. And get the brothers out there, full show." Grit pushed Declan gently but firmly behind a massive stack of tool chests in the corner of the garage. "Stay out of sight, but watch. You're about to see how this family handles a threat." Outside in the courtyard, the heavy steel security gates were closed and locked. On the other side, clearly visible through the chain link, a polished black Cadillac Escalade sat idling, its engine purring. The windows were so heavily tinted, they looked black. Two men stepped out. They didn't look like cops. Cops had a specific posture, a specific swagger. These guys were something else. They wore expensive dark tactical jackets, the kind that cost $500 and had hidden pockets for weapons. Tactical pants, boots that cost more than most people's rent. They carried themselves with the arrogant swagger of men who were used to getting their way through intimidation and the implied threat of violence. Ex-military, probably. Or high-end corporate security. The kind hired to do things cops couldn't or wouldn't do. One of the men, the taller of the two with a shaved head and a scar on his temple, walked up to the chain-link gate and rattled it aggressively. "Open it up," the man shouted, his voice carrying across the compound. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk." The heavy metal door of the clubhouse swung open with a creak of hinges. Reaper stepped out into the cold afternoon air. He was wearing his full cut now, the president patch gleaming in the pale sunlight, the death's head patch on the back visible even from the front because of how the leather caught the light. Behind him, the clubhouse emptied out like a clown car. 20 full-patched Hells Angels poured into the courtyard in silence, fanning out behind their president in a tight, disciplined formation. They moved like soldiers, like men who knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't yell. They didn't run. They didn't posture. They just stood there forming an impenetrable leather wall. Some held heavy wrenches from the garage. Others held tire irons. Others just crossed their massive arms. The message was clear. You are not welcome here. The silence was deafening. The two men outside the gate hesitated for just a second. The swagger faltered just a bit as they stared down 24 of the most dangerous men in the Pacific Northwest. "Can I help you, boys?" Reaper asked, his voice carrying easily over the wind. He sounded almost friendly. Almost. The lewd security man cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure and his authority. "We're looking for a runaway. A kid. 17 years old, skinny, dark hair, goes by the name Declan Thorne. We have reliable information that he's on this property." "A tip," Reaper raised an eyebrow. "From who?" "That's not your concern," the man replied coldly, trying to sound in control. "We work for the boy's legal guardian in Seattle. He's a ward of the state. He ran away from his foster placement, and we're here to bring him back where he belongs. We don't want any trouble with your club. Just hand over the kid, and we'll be on our way. Nobody needs to get hurt." Reaper slowly walked up to the gate until he was mere inches from the chain link, staring directly into the lead contractor's eyes. "You work for Victor Harlan," Reaper stated. It wasn't a question. The security man blinked, clearly surprised that this biker knew the name. "Mr. Harlan is a highly respected man in Seattle. The boy is disturbed. He needs professional help. He needs to come home." "Home," Reaper repeated, spitting the word out like it was poison. "You mean the basement, or the end of a belt, or maybe the top of a flight of stairs where he can push another kid down?" The second security man stepped forward, his hand moving inside his jacket toward what was probably a firearm. "Listen here, biker. We have legal authority to retrieve this minor. If you don't open this gate right now and hand him over, we're calling the state police, the county sheriff, and the feds. We'll have this compound raided so fast your head will spin. You're harboring a runaway. That's a crime." Reaper didn't even flinch. He didn't move. He just smiled. A cold, dangerous smile that didn't reach his eyes. He let out a low, dark laugh that sent chills down Declan's spine even from 30 feet away. "Call them," Reaper said simply. The security man stared at him confused. "What?" "I said call them," Reaper repeated, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with absolute menace. "Call the state police. Call the sheriff. Call the FBI. Hell, call the National Guard if you want. I'll wait." Reaper pulled his cell phone from his pocket and held it up. "Because my brothers in Seattle have been very busy the last 3 days. We paid a visit to some people. People who don't like Victor Harlan very much. People he's hurt over the years. We found the doctor who treated little Tommy when he went to the ICU with a fractured skull, Dr. Marianne Rodriguez at Seattle Children's Hospital. She documented everything but was pressured not to report it. We found the social worker who quit the Department of Children and Families because Harlan bribed her supervisor to look the other way. Dr. Rebecca Flynn. She kept copies of her reports. We found 3 former foster kids willing to talk. We compiled a nice fat folder of evidence." The color began to drain from the lead security man's face like water from a bathtub. "We handed that folder to a federal prosecutor in Seattle this morning." Reaper continued, his eyes locked onto the man like a predator. "Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Voss. The kind of prosecutor who doesn't care who you play golf with or how much money you donate. Right now, at this very second, the FBI is tossing Mr. Harlan's offices, his house, and his construction company warehouses. He's not a legal guardian anymore. He's a target of a federal investigation for child abuse, fraud, embezzlement of state funds, and corruption." Reaper leaned even closer to the gate, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "So you go ahead and call the cops. Tell them you're looking for Declan Thorne, because the feds are looking for him too, as their star witness. And anyone who tries to grab him before he testifies is going to be charged with witness tampering and obstruction of justice. Federal charges, 10 years minimum. The two men exchanged a panicked look. Their payday, their powerful boss, their untouchable status, it was all evaporating in front of their eyes. "You guys made a mistake coming here." Blade stepped forward from the line of bikers, slapping a heavy metal pipe into his palm with a meaty thunk. "This is private property, and the kid he's club business now. You have exactly 10 seconds to get back in that SUV and disappear off our road. If you're still here at 11, Reaper growled, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, we open the gate and we don't call the cops afterward. The threat was absolute, final. The Hells Angels behind Reaper shifted as one stepping forward in perfect synchronization. The sound of 20 pairs of boots hitting concrete in unison was like a war drum. The security men didn't wait. They turned and bolted for the Escalade like their lives depended on it. The taller one tripped over his own feet, stumbled, recovered. They threw themselves into the vehicle. The engine roared to life. Tires spun on the gravel as they frantically threw it into reverse, then into drive, tearing down the road until they were completely out of sight, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust. Reaper stood at the gate for a long moment, watching the dust settle in the afternoon light. Then he turned around and looked toward the garage. Declan slowly stepped out from behind the tool chests on legs that felt like water. He was trembling violently and not from cold. Tears streamed down his face, cutting tracks through the garage grime. He had heard everything, every single word. The monster that had haunted his nightmares for 19 months, the man who had made him a ghost, was finally being hunted himself. Reaper walked over to the boy and placed a heavy, reassuring hand on his good shoulder. "The ghost is dead, Declan," Reaper said softly, his voice gentle now. "You're alive, and you're home." But even as the words settled over him like a warm blanket, even as relief flooded through him, Declan knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Because 2 days later, a silver sedan with government plates rolled up to the compound gates. Agent Silas Kane of the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped out, flashing his badge and credentials to the prospects on guard. Reaper had been expecting him. Declan sat in the president's office 20 minutes later, his hands sweating, his heart racing. Agent Kane was in his early 40s, sharp-eyed and intense, wearing a suit that had seen too many courtrooms and not enough dry cleaning. He set a manila folder on Reaper's desk and opened it with practiced efficiency. "We have the financial records," Agent Kane said, adjusting his tie with one hand. "Embezzlement of state foster care funds dating back 7 years. We have testimonies from Dr. Rebecca Flynn, the social worker who quit, and Dr. Marianne Rodriguez from Seattle Children's Hospital. We have hospital records from Tommy Brennan's ICU stay that directly contradict the official story of an accidental fall. We have testimony from 3 other former foster children. We have Harlan backed into a corner for fraud, embezzlement, and child endangerment." He looked directly at Declan, his gaze unflinching. But a good defense attorney can muddy a paper trail. They can discredit paperwork. They can make financial records look like accounting errors. We need the human element. We need a victim willing to stand up in court and tell a jury exactly what happened. We need you on the stand to testify about the basement, the starvation, the threats, what happened to Tommy. Declan's chest tightened so hard he thought his ribs might crack. The thought of being in the same room as Victor Harlan, of looking him in the eye, of having to relive it all in front of strangers, it made him want to vomit. "In Seattle?" Declan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Kane nodded. "The trial starts February 15th, 2 weeks from now. We can offer you witness protection. Full WITSEC if necessary, armored convoy to and from the courthouse. Safe house under 24-hour guard." No, the word didn't come from Declan. It came from Reaper, who was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed over his massive chest. Kane sighed a sound of frustration. "Mr. Stone, with all due respect, Harlan still has resources. He has men on his payroll, desperate men who might do something stupid to protect themselves. We can't risk the star witness. Your system failed this boy. Reaper said, his voice low and dangerous, each word carefully chosen. Your system handed him over to a monster when he was 12 years old. Your system ignored his cries for help. Your system let him rot under a bridge for 19 months. You don't get to protect him now. That ship sailed a long time ago. Kane looked from the towering biker to the terrified teenager, clearly trying to find an angle a way in. Then what do you propose, Mr. Stone? Reaper's eyes gleamed with something that might have been satisfaction. We ride. The healing process was agonizingly slow, both for Declan's shattered shoulder and his fractured mind. The Hells Angels compound became his sanctuary. For the next 3 months, he didn't step a single foot outside the steel gates. He ate 3 square meals a day, put on 28 pounds of much-needed weight, and learned how to rebuild a carburetor under Wrench's watchful eye. For the first time in his memory, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. Winter came to Oregon with a vengeance. The rain turned to sleet, then snow. The compound transformed into a fortress against the cold. Declan worked in the heated garage during the days, his hands slowly remembering what it felt like to create instead of just survive. Wrench was a patient teacher, a quiet man with forearms like steel cables and a seemingly infinite understanding of engines. Carburetors are honest, Wrench told him one afternoon as they rebuilt a 1970 shovelhead. They don't lie. You treat them right, they run. You half-ass it, they fail. No politics, no games. Declan found a strange peace in the work. The methodical process of disassembly and reassembly gave his mind something to focus on other than the approaching trial date that loomed like a dark storm on the horizon. At night, he slept in the small room that had become his. Elstone had brought him blankets and pillows, a reading lamp, and a stack of books she thought he might like. She ran the clubhouse kitchen with quiet efficiency and didn't ask questions Declan wasn't ready to answer. Violet came down to visit him almost every day after school. She'd sit on a stool in the garage and talk while he worked, telling him about her classes and her friends and the new tricks she was teaching Max. The golden retriever had become Declan's shadow whenever Violet had brought him to the compound, lying at his feet while he worked. Agent Kane visited twice more each time, pressing harder about the trial. The evidence was solid, he assured them. Harlan's construction companies were being audited. Financial irregularities were piling up. Testimonies from former employees painted a picture of a man who used his wealth and connections to operate above the law. But they needed Declan. The jury needs to see you, Kane said during his third visit, sitting across from Reaper's desk, while Declan stood near the window. They need to hear what he did, not from a doctor's report, from you. I know, Declan said quietly. The trial starts February 15th, 2 weeks from now. Declan nodded. He'd been counting down the days. We'll have an armored transport ready, Kane continued. We'll get you to the courthouse through a secure entrance. You'll be in protective custody the entire time. No, Declan said. Kane blinked. Excuse me? No protective custody, no armored transport, no secure entrance. Declan turned from the window and looked directly at the FBI agent. I walked through the front door of that courthouse. I'm not hiding anymore. Declan Harlan has resources. He has people who might do something desperate. We can't guarantee your safety if you're exposed. I'm not asking you to, Declan said. His voice was steady now, stronger than it had been 3 months ago. I'm asking you to let me do this my way. Kane looked at Reaper, who was leaning back in his chair with an expression that might have been pride. The kid's made up his mind, Reaper said. Kane closed his briefcase with a sharp snap. Then I hope you know what you're doing. After the agent left, Declan remained standing by the window, looking out at the courtyard where light snow was beginning to fall. You sure about this? Reaper asked. No, Declan admitted, but I can't spend the rest of my life being afraid of him. If I hide now, I'll always be hiding. Reaper stood up and walked over to stand beside him. For a moment, they both just watched the snow fall. You don't have to do this alone, Reaper said quietly. Declan swallowed hard. The question he'd been holding inside for days finally found its way out. Can the brothers ride with me? He asked. Not to scare anyone, just so I'm not alone when I walk up those steps. Reaper looked at the 17-year-old kid who had thrown himself into an icy river without a second thought, who had survived 19 months on the streets, who was now asking not to be saved, but simply not to be abandoned. Yeah, kid, Reaper said. We can do that. That night, Reaper made calls. California, Nevada, Washington, Arizona. The word went out. A kid who had nothing gave everything to save one of ours. Now he's facing his demon. He asked for his family to ride with him. The response was immediate. 2 weeks later, on a frigid Tuesday morning in February, Declan stood in the clubhouse courtyard wearing a sharp-tailored black suit the club had bought for him. His shoulder was mostly healed, though it still ached when the weather turned cold. His posture was straight. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs. Elle had cut his hair the night before, trimmed it neat and professional. Doc had checked him over one last time. Violet had given him a lucky nickel, pressing it into his palm. Then the rumbling started. It began as distant thunder. The gates of the compound opened, and they poured through. From California, the San Bernardino charter arrived first, 20 bikes. From Nevada, the Reno chapter followed. The Seattle charter, the brothers who had compiled the evidence against Harlan, rolled in with 25 riders. They kept coming. 50 bikes became 70. 70 became 100. The courtyard became a sea of chrome and black leather. 100 became 150. The roar of engines shook the windows. By the time the last charter arrived from Southern California, 200 fully patched Hells Angels had gathered. 200 outlaws had ridden through bitter winter weather for one purpose: to escort a 17-year-old kid to court. Reaper walked up to Declan and handed him a custom leather jacket to wear over his suit. You ride in the sidecar with me, kid, right at the front. Declan climbed into the sidecar attached to Reaper's Road Glide. As Reaper kicked the engine to life, 200 other Harleys followed. The noise was apocalyptic. It shook the trees, it vibrated in Declan's bones. It was the sound of family, of solidarity, of a promise that he wasn't alone. They hit Interstate 5 North like a hurricane. The FBI sedan tried to lead the way, but it was quickly swallowed by the formation. Traffic parted for them. Civilian cars pulled to the shoulder. State troopers turned on their lights and stopped civilian traffic to let the convoy pass. For the entire 4-hour ride to Seattle, Declan looked back at the endless column of headlights. Victor Harlan had told him he was worthless, that he was alone, that no one would ever care if he disappeared. Looking at the army of leather riding behind him, Declan finally understood just how wrong Harlan had been. The King County Courthouse had never seen anything like it. When the convoy arrived in downtown Seattle, the roar of engines echoed off the skyscrapers. News crews scrambled to capture the spectacle. Police had barricaded the front steps, but the bikers were disciplined. They parked in perfectly aligned rows stretching for 3 city blocks. The engines cut in unison. 200 men dismounted and stood beside their machines waiting. Reaper, flanked by Wrenchblade and Doc, formed a tight square around Declan. They walked up the courthouse steps through a corridor of silence. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. The bikers moved as one unit. Inside, courthouse security had been briefed. The bikers went through metal detectors one by one, removing keys and belt buckles, submitting to searches without complaint. Courtroom 4B was on the 3rd floor. The bailiffs stiffened as the procession approached. Reaper nodded to them and the doors were open. The courtroom was packed. Media filled the back rows. The prosecution table was staffed by 3 lawyers, including federal prosecutor Patricia Voss. And sitting at the defense table in a 3-piece designer suit was Victor Harlan. He looked exactly as Declan remembered. Mid-50s silver hair, a face that belonged on campaign posters. Confident, untouchable. Then the gallery doors opened. The bailiffs instinctively reached for their belts as Reaper strode in, followed by 40 Hells Angels. They filed into the wooden pews filling the entire right side of the gallery. The imposing wall of tattoos and death's head patches sucked the arrogance out of the room. Victor Harlan looked back. His smug smile faltered. He looked at the bikers, then his eyes found Declan. For the first time in his life, Declan saw fear flicker across Harlan's face. Judge Margaret Chen entered. Everyone rose. The trial began. The prosecution laid out their case with surgical precision. Financial records, testimonies from Dr. Flynn and Dr. Rodriguez, hospital records from Tommy's ICU stay. But the real moment came on day 2. The prosecution calls Declan Thorne to the stand. Declan stood. His legs felt like water. But then he felt a hand on his shoulder. Reaper, sitting in the front row, gave him a single nod. Declan walked to the witness stand. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do." Prosecutor Voss approaches. "Please state your name for the record." "Declan Thorne." "How old are you, Declan?" 17. "And you were a foster child in the care of the defendant, Victor Harlan?" "Yes, ma'am." Voss walked him through it step by step. When he entered the system, when he was placed with Harlan. The first time Harlan hit him. The basement, the starvation, Tommy. Declan didn't cry. He didn't break. He simply told the truth in a clear voice that filled the silent courtroom. "Did you ever report the abuse to authorities?" "I tried. I told my caseworker. She said Mr. Harlan was a respected member of the community, and I needed to be more grateful." "What happened after you threatened to go to the police about Tommy's injuries?" "He locked me in the basement for 5 days. The first 2 days, no food or water. He told me if I ever spoke about what happened, he'd make sure I disappeared into juvenile lockup and never came out." "Why did you run away?" Declan looked directly at Harlan for the first time. "Because if I stayed, I was going to die in that house." The defense attorney stood for cross-examination. He paced in front of the jury. "Mr. Thorne, you're currently living with the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, correct?" "Yes, sir." "A criminal organization." "Objection," Voss said sharply. "Counsel is characterizing." "Sustained," Judge Chen said. The defense attorney smiled thinly. "Let me rephrase. How can this jury trust the word of someone who associates with criminals?" Declan sat forward. His eyes didn't waver. "Those men you're talking about, they were the first people in my entire life who saw me as a human being. They didn't save me. I saved myself when I pulled a little girl out of an icy river. But they gave me a place to stand while I healed. They gave me food when I was starving. They protected me when the man sitting at that table sent people to drag me back." He paused. "I don't have anything to gain from this. No settlement, no payout. I just want to make sure Victor Harlan never touches another kid again." The defense attorney's smile faded. The jury watched Declan. They saw the scars. They saw the truth in a 17-year-old's eyes. They saw 40 bikers sitting in silent support, not as a threat, but as a family. The trial lasted 4 days. On Friday afternoon, the jury returned after 2 hours. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The foreman stood. "In the matter of the state of Washington versus Victor Harlan on the charge of child endangerment, how do you find guilty? On the charge of fraud, guilty. On the charge of embezzlement of state funds, guilty." The foreman read through 17 charges. The verdict was the same every time. Guilty. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Victor Harlan collapsed into his chair, his face devoid of color. Judge Chen revoked bail immediately. 2 marshals hauled Harlan to his feet, securing his hands behind his back with steel cuffs. "Sentencing will be scheduled for March 1st. But let me be clear, Mr. Harlan. You are looking at 28 years minimum." As the marshals led Harlan past the gallery, he looked at Declan one last time. Declan didn't look away. He met Harlan's eyes with a steady gaze that said everything that needed to be said. "You don't own me anymore." Outside the courthouse, the winter sun broke through the Seattle clouds. Declan stood on the steps, taking his first deep breath of truly free air. Reporters swarmed. "Declan, how do you feel about the verdict?" Declan held up a hand. The question stopped. 200 bikers stood behind him. I don't hate Victor Harlan, Declan said quietly. I pity him. He spent his entire life hurting people because he could, because he thought his money made him untouchable. He paused. I'm spending my life fixing engines and helping people. I saved a little girl from drowning. I'm learning a trade. I've got a family now. He glanced back at Reaper. I already won. Reaper walked up beside Declan and lit a cigarette. How does it feel, kid? Like I can finally wake up, Declan said. Good, Reaper said, tossing his lighter to Declan. Because it's a long ride home, and you've got an engine to rebuild tomorrow. 5 years later, the August sun baked the cracked asphalt outside the Hells Angels clubhouse. Inside the cavernous garage, classic rock fought a losing battle against the roar of a freshly rebuilt knucklehead engine. Declan cut the ignition. He wiped motor oil off his forehead with a calloused forearm. At 22, he was unrecognizable from the emaciated boy who had once huddled beneath the bridge. He had filled out his frame layered with muscle. He wore faded jeans, steel-toed boots, and a black t-shirt. His hair was cut short. He had a confident grin. He owned his own tools, paid rent on a clean apartment, and had earned the title of lead mechanic for the club's custom shop. Hey, Grease Monkey. 12-year-old Violet came sprinting toward him, tossing a football that spiraled into his chest. She was tall for her age, wearing a denim vest over a band t-shirt. She laughed. Trotting behind her was Max Gray around the muzzle now. Nice spiral squirt, Declan chuckled. Where's your dad? Inside, Violet said. Church is starting in 10 minutes. He said to tell you to get your boots inside. She paused. He sounded serious. All right, Declan said, ruffling her hair. Declan walked to the utility sink, scrubbed his hands, and walked down the hallway toward the meeting room. The room was packed. The air was thick with tobacco smoke, beer, and worn leather. And electricity made the hairs on Declan's neck stand up. He took his place at the back, hands clasped behind his back. He had been a hang-around for 2 years, a prospect for the last 12 months. He had scrubbed floors until his knees bled, stood guard in bitter rain, hauled bikes out of ditches. He wore the bottom organ rocker on his vest, but the center was blank. No patch, no death's head. Reaper stood at the head of the table. His beard had more gray now, but he was just as imposing. Reaper picked up a gavel and slammed it down. Crack. The room fell silent. They moved through standard business. Then Reaper closed his ledger. He set the gavel down. The tension spiked. Bring him up, Reaper ordered. Wrench and Blade escorted Declan down the aisle to the front of the table. Declan's heart hammered. It felt just like the river. Reaper looked down at the young man. He didn't see a broken teenager anymore. He saw a mechanic, a fighter, a brother. 5 years ago, Reaper's voice broke the silence. A boy with no name and no shoes jumped into 50 degrees of black ice to save my daughter. He didn't have to. The world had beaten him down. Society had thrown him away. He had every reason to let that river take her. Reaper placed both hands flat on the table. But he didn't. He took the hit on the rock so she wouldn't. He gave my little girl his breath when she had none left. He reached beneath the table. You came to us with nothing, Declan. Not even boots on your feet. But you didn't ask for a handout. You put your head down. You worked. You bled for this charter. And you earned our respect. Reaper pulled out a pristine black leather cut and laid it on the table. On the back, stitched in red and gold, was the winged death's head of the Hells Angels. Top rocker Hells Angels. Bottom rocker Oregon. And tonight, Reaper said, by a unanimous vote of this charter, you earned your patch. The room exploded. 24 outlaws roared, slamming fists and boots against the table. Wrench slapped Declan on the back. Blade whistled. Reaper picked up the cut and walked around the table. He held it out. Declan's vision blurred. Tears spilled over, but they weren't tears of pain anymore. They were tears of triumph. He reached out with hands that had once been numb with frostbite and slipped his arms into the leather. It fit perfectly. Reaper grabbed Declan by the collar and pulled him into a crushing embrace. "Welcome home, brother," Reaper whispered fiercely. Declan stepped back. He looked at Wrench at Doc, at Blade at Reaper. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't a victim. He wasn't forgotten. He was seen. He was feared by those who deserved to fear him, and he was loved by those who stood beside him. Through the window, Declan could see Violet peeking in Elle's hand on her shoulder. The 12-year-old grinned and gave him a thumbs up. Declan grinned back. The boy who once had nothing had finally found everything. And for the first time in his life, Declan Thorne knew exactly where he belonged.